It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker. He is without a doubt a central and indispensable part of the UFO research scene here in New South Wales. He basically grew up with flying saucer investigation groups since the early 60s. He is one of the founders of both INU4 in 1988 and U4 New South Wales in 1991, two of the sponsors of this seminar. He is currently the director, or president if you will, of the UFO Research New South Wales group, and also the editor of the magazine The UFO Reporter. He has a special interest in UFO abduction cases and is currently producing a book on the 1909 airships seen over New Zealand and Australia, which he will talk about today. Unfortunately, though, there's just not enough of him to go around. He's a good candidate for cloning, and we're very happy to have most of him here today. Would you please give a hearty welcome to an inspiring and dedicated individual, Brian Dickerson.
Wow. Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure what to say. I've actually had quite a long interest in the airships of 1909. In fact, I think I collected my first account, a newspaper account, about 32 years ago. I just realised that a couple of days ago. But the thing is, no one has really asked me to talk about them except in the last couple of years when I said that I was thinking of writing a book. And in particular, I got together with a gentleman called Peter Fleury, who's now back in New Zealand, in Dunedin, and we've been combining our information and trying to come up with some really good material. There's some brilliant material, and I hope to show that some of that here this afternoon. First of all, can I have the first slide, please? Okay, for those of you who don't know, this is New Zealand. Basically, the main area for in 1909, there are a series of Zeppelin-like craft seen over New Zealand and in Australia, particularly centred around this area in Dunedin, around Dunedin, slightly south and to the west of it, which at this time of the year, and at that time of the year too, was pretty cold, as you can imagine. Now, I want to particularly just dwell on the early material, the stuff that comes from the very first sighting that was reported, why the whole thing sort of really got out of control, as it were, and became New Zealand's biggest ever UFO flap. And then look at some of the more interesting Australian material that Peter and I have been particularly coming up with in the last few years. It's a lot harder to get, unfortunately. Now, I would first of all like to show you a map of how it got started. Okay, this area is Dunedin City itself is up about here off this map. Now, what happened essentially was that on the 11th of July in 1909, a number of people were seeing some friends off at the railway station. Oh my goodness, I can't even focus on it here. Over here at a place called Stirling. Looking across, they noticed an unusual series of lights over the Kaitangata Hills out over the area known as Wongaloa. Now, this is only about 10-15 kilometres away. They watched for about half an hour. They saw their friend off on the train, I believe. And then one of the men sort of started walking back home. He was then watched this aircraft. The lights then reappeared again. And they seemed to sort of come in, circle over, and then follow him and go up inland, where they disappeared in what he said was the direction of the Blue Mountains. Now, I'll just switch to another map here. Right. Once again, here we have the Wongaloa Hills, and the thing to particularly notice here is the Clutha River. The Clutha is a very large, very dynamic river with a lot of water in it. It appears that the airship, as was called then, moved up the Clutha River until it came to a bunch of hills. They're certainly mountains by Australian standards. They're really a little bit more than hills by New Zealand standards. And it was just seen here disappearing in this direction, and no one quite knew what happened to it. Nothing much more happened for the next couple of weeks until all of a sudden this little township, this red dot here, a place called Kelso, started to report a series of very, very unusual phenomena. These were daylight sightings. Now, Could I please have the next map, thanks. This is the township of Kelso as it never was. Basically, this is a plan of the town as it was designed to be in 1875. It's at the conjunction of a stream here and a rather large river. The area floods a lot. You can see this by the Oxbow Lakes. And the result is that every now and then it gets a really dramatic flood occurs in this area. In fact, it's so dramatic that about 15 years ago, the township had to be done away with. They had a series of 100-year floods within about 4 or 5 years. And they had so many, in fact, that they decided to abandon the site. All the houses were carted away, and the township of Kelso just doesn't exist anymore, which is really rather sad. But in 1909, suddenly, it became very much the centre of attention in New Zealand. The account that you've probably seen most of, next slide please, is from an account that comes in the Otago Daily Times, the newspaper that comes out of Dunedin, a very well-considered newspaper. Now, basically, a daylight sighting. This airship was seen to come out from the area to the to the east of Kelso itself, circle over the town, and then head back the way it had come back towards the Blue Mountains. It went from, seemed to have come out from here, came out over the town, and then the children watching it at midday thereabouts went back to the Blue Mountains. It's also witnessed by one woman, Mrs. Russell. And this has always been the story as far as most people have taken it. However, the Otago Daily Times also put out a weekly newspaper called the Otago Witness. And I avoided actually looking up this particular publication for a number of years because I thought, in fact, it was probably some sort of religious publication. Next slide, please. Then someone said, have you tried looking at the Otago Witness because it includes photographs? And suddenly, here is a photograph of Mrs. Russell, the person who confirmed what the children had seen, and with her family. And I, in fact, have seen another photograph. This is actually taken from a book called Kismet for Kelso, written by a local historian, Mrs. Brownlee. And I think it's wrongly attributed. I think, in fact, some of the children along here are some of the same children who produced the diagrams that we've just seen before. Next slide, please. The other interesting photograph that appears in the same area, in the same publication of the Otago Witness, is this. It shows the area where it was actually taken. Now, where it was actually sighted. Now, this, to the east of Kelso itself, there's a bit of a hill here called the Wooded Hill. Nowadays, it's just covered with gorse and scrub. It's rather derelict. In those days, it was probably pretty derelict as well. I think all the trees were chopped down, which probably contributed to the flooding that you get in the area. But on this particular day, I think it was the 26th of July, at lunchtime, the kids had been the school bell had rung. The township's only a couple of miles long. The children had been let out of the school, probably to go home for lunch, and a number of them reported this object just after 12 o'clock. We've seen it to come out from behind the wooded hill, at this point here, turn around, and then go back. And there's a couple of numbers here which indicate where two of the major witnesses were. This indicates that, in fact, they were probably less than 100 metres from the actual object itself. So, we've had a quick look at the actual pictures that the children had produced. Recently, we've been having a look at how big the aircraft actually was. It's quite important when you're dealing with balloons. It definitely wasn't, for example, an aeroplane. This is probably our first attempt at what the Kelso airship. In New Zealand, there were so many sightings from around Kelso area, they were usually referred to as the Kelso airship. The colour was black, and I've included up in this corner here, this is an outline of Blériot's aircraft that had just crossed the channel. One of the reasons we believe why it suddenly became such a big issue was because Blériot had just crossed the English Channel. And the whole thing was treated as a huge success. Everyone was absolutely triumphant about it. Some of the reports in the newspapers at the time were quite ecstatic that at long last, man had conquered the English Channel. It showed for the first time that aeroplanes were a distinct commercial possibilities, a form of transport. They weren't just a rich man's toy. And people began to get very, very excited. The other big development that was going on in Europe at the same time was, of course, Zeppelin, Count Zeppelin's experiments with airships. Now, I'll go into those in just a moment. And of course, airships were in fact seen in many ways as being much more successful as aeroplanes. These are still being, Blériot and his friends were being considered very much as playing around with toys. But the channel was sort of changing all that very, very quickly. In the meantime, people were still very much aware of of airships. And the Kelso airship itself was seen as being, okay, some local inventor probably playing around with the aircraft, with a balloon and building a balloon. There was a very real problem, however, that balloons, in fact, at that time required an awful lot of effort. Now, as I've said, this is our very first attempt to draw the airship. And I think when in recent months I've been looking at it again and I'm not too happy with it. Can I have the next slide, please? But the main reason why we did this, went through this exercise, was to have a look at the size of the gas envelope, because that determines how much lifting power your balloon has got. If you presume, for example, this is filled with hydrogen, then you can sort of get an estimate of how much weight it can lift and how big this thing would have to be. Now, at the same time, if we look at the most up-to-date aircraft in the world at the time, this is Zeppelin's L5, which later on became Zeppelin 2. This thing is absolutely massive. It is several hundred feet long. It's got over 500,000 cubic feet of gas in it, hydrogen mostly. These things are so big, they actually built them out over lakes for two reasons. First of all, you need a nice big flat surface to build it on, and they built these floating hangars on lakes. The other reason was that lakes, of course, contained water. Hydrogen is very inflammable, and by surrounding themselves with water, it was thought less likely for the hydrogen to catch on fire. I mean, they were dealing with really dangerous stuff. This is 1909 high-tech. The other high-tech development, as I put it down here, is Blériot's aeroplane. Top speed, if I remember correctly, of about 40 miles an hour. The top speed of these balloons, these big Zeppelins, is only about 30 miles an hour. By comparison, on the same scale, these are all on the same scale, this is the size of the Kelso airship. Now, I've been rather generous. If I'd made it any smaller, it obviously isn't a balloon, and it reduces the lifting capacity of it. It reduces the size of the envelope. So if you're looking at something like this Kelso airship, it would still only have an effective lifting capacity of about 100 to 150 kilos, which is not a lot. So it makes you start to wonder, perhaps, there's something else here, that it really wasn't a balloon. Now, as I've said, I've recently been looking at redrawing this because some of the drawings and some of the descriptions don't quite fit. There is a problem with this basic shape here in that you don't have, and many of you will see this in things like barrage balloons, you have a fin built in at the back for stability. Now, in those days, people were still coming to terms with the language. Quite often, for example, they didn't refer to a propeller at the back spinning, they said it was like a wheel. And of course, when you think back to 1909 and what wheels were like, you had spoked carriage wheels. When they sort of are rolling along very fast, of course, the spokes tend to sort of, develop that special propeller-like look. And the children actually describe a wheel on the back spinning very quickly. This wheel figure is very common through so many of the accounts of the airships that were seen in New Zealand and Australia at the time. People saw reflections of this thing at the back. What I believe that instead how you had at the time of the airfin, I actually think that the gas bag was probably flatter up there. This is still sort of the bottom view, but the top, the side view would make this much flatter. You would still have the gondola down the bottom. And from what I've seen, and other descriptions, what was often described as sails was in fact a kind of rudder. These kinds of rudders here were in fact used in some of the earlier French models of aircraft, of balloons, to give it stability, to stop it so you could actually guide it as it went along, keep it on the straight and narrow and level. That would be the idea of these kinds of sails, or in this case, ailerons. The ailerons on this side, for example, or the stabilizing fins here, would keep it, so as you go along like that. These would sort of help keep it moving straight ahead. The problem about this particular design is, from an aeronautical point of view, is it's really not very stable. Given the New Zealand weather conditions, this is really rather dangerous. You're really much better to go for the traditional, well, what we now call a traditional barrage balloon design with a fin sticking up at the back. But I think that this particular one, once I've modified this and put on these other structures that were mentioned and provided in some drawings, then we'll have something which is much closer to the Kelso airship. Interestingly, it makes it like no other airship that has ever been designed or will probably ever be designed because of these structures here. So it all just adds interest to it. Now, the other interesting thing about the airships is that they were also seen in Australia. And really this was an Australasian phenomenon. It wasn't just in New Zealand. The thing is that in New Zealand, okay, the distances were not as great as in Australia. You had a large number of newspapers which carried good accounts of local events. And it's quite noticeable that when you go through the literature and all the newspaper material, that when people are commenting on something a long way from them, they tend to sort of take in more of the myths, like there are accounts of people actually hearing voices coming from the aircraft, talking possibly in German or something like that, or French or some foreign tongue. When you actually go to the local newspapers where this was meant to have occurred, you don't get those details coming out. This is an embellishment that occurred later. And you tend to get more of these embellishments the further you are away from it. Now, it became obvious during Peter Fleury and my investigations that these are also seen in Victoria. We kind of thought that at the time this was a copycat event. But there are certain accounts. This one is from the Otago Daily Times, for example. It refers to the Dandenongs, an area just southeast of Melbourne itself, where a reverend gentleman was staying for the weekend, and he and his neighbours watched a series of lights. Now, surprisingly enough, his account, which is one of the first accounts from this particular period in 1909, is very similar to the very first accounts we had from Wongaloa, Stirling, Balclutha, that sort of thing. It's surprisingly similar in many qualities to the lights that were seen at that time. It's also very similar to so many UFO accounts that UFO investigators like myself, come across today. Now, can I have the next map, please? It's in Australia. Okay, fine. Dandenongs down here. Also seen people on a train, that the Melbourne to Sydney Express around Hilltop and Picton. Was also reported. They watched it for quite some time. The parallels between this and the quality of the reporting from people who would not be aware of the actual what had been happening in New Zealand, aware of the details, is very similar to example for something that was reported from the west coast of the South Island of New Zealand, where a large number of people on a train going from Hokitika to Greymouth reported seeing this balloon light, this object out to sea, a light bobbing up and down with a waving, undulating motion, very similar to what was seen at Hilltop. Okay, it was also, I have a report that comes from Zeehan in Tasmania. I'm having difficulty verifying that because, once again, local libraries in Australia don't always have very many copies of newspapers from other states. They don't always have very good copies of old newspapers. You really need to be in the area. The Zeehan account is alluded to by Sydney newspapers, but I cannot find any direct account of it. An account over here, the suburb, I think, of Pingelly in Perth, a fairly sceptical account on the Western Australia about something that had been seen there. And later on, the latest account of one which I find very interesting because it's actually a chance for Peter Fleury and myself to try and validate some of the working assumptions that we've been coming to by going through all this material. It comes from the 25th of October, Onslow, up here in northwest Australia. Basically, I think this is a very, very, very good sighting. On October the 25th, Mrs. A.J. Rowe, wife of the manager of Minderoo Station near Onslow, was the first to spot the strange craft. It looked compact like a dirigible balloon, a bit like the Kelso airship I had previously shown. Mrs. Ross said, but appeared to be squarer and more like an aeroplane. That might well explain the extra wings and things that it seemed to have on the ailerons. The sun shone on it and flashes came from it. That flashes came from it is very similar to New Zealand accounts where flashes of light were seen coming off the propeller or the wheel at the back, as though reflected from something revolving or from metalwork. 3 station hands also saw the object, which the newspapers of the day described as a mystery airship, and one of them made a sketch of it. The customs collector at Onslow, Mr. Elsie Temperley, submitted a detailed report on the sighting to the Minister of Customs, who passed it on to the Defence Department. Mr. Temperley thought that the object really was an airship. the work he suggests of an inventor who was experimenting, or perhaps from a foreign vessel anchored off the coast. This is one thing too that's extremely interesting as far as I'm concerned as a researcher. The comparison of the arguments that people made for what the object was at the time. It was obviously from some sort of a ship off the coast, perhaps a German ship that's lost and gone astray. It was perhaps the work of some inventor. Now, Peter and I have spent an awful lot of time investigating what local inventors were doing at the time. It certainly wasn't. It's also quite outside the technology that was available at the time. And this particular case, I really would like to pursue it if I can, but it's very difficult. I presume we have to go to Perth to follow it up, to see if I can get a copy of the report that was made in 1909 to the Defence Department. Presumably that is still filed away somewhere. It would be a wonderful item to have to sort of verify many of the assumptions that we've been working on at this stage. Now, oops, okay. I'm afraid I've had to give you a very, very quick tour of this. There's a heap of information available. There are lots of, a huge number of newspapers around, a significant number of them in Australia which have this material in it. And we really need to follow this up because it's a very, very interesting area. Nowadays, I think one of the things we've also got to look at is, could we do, what would it take for us to build a Kelso airship today? And obviously, we'd certainly go about it differently. We could probably build one, I think, that would work probably much better than the original, in fact, fairly cheaply for perhaps a few $1,000s. But in those days, when you look at the technology that was going on, the kind of advances that people were making in aircraft, you've got to look at this very, very seriously indeed. Now, while some academics have looked at this subject of the airships of 1909, they tend to see it as being a response to the arms build-up that was going on in the Northern Hemisphere just before World War I. And they sort of say that, this is people saying that this is the Germans scared down under. People were scared of airships. But I would like to go back to the very, very first account that came through in New Zealand. And in fact, it's very similar in many respects to the same sort of accounts as when Louis Blériot flew the Channel. People were quite ecstatic. They thought, at long last, someone had done something fantastic with airships. And in this particular case, I should point out too that some of the causes that were discussed was also Mars. Mars was fairly close to the Earth at this time. And this article, this Mars argument was actually revived in the 1950s, 1954 in New Zealand, as being another indication that Mars, close to the Earth in 1909, close to the Earth in 1954, was in fact a source of these objects. It was quite an elegant debate undertaken in New Zealand at the time. But finally, I'd like to end up with one of the very first accounts from the Bell Clutha Free Press. We can't find the original. Surprisingly enough, although there's a lot of newspaper material about, the Bell Clutha Free Press does not appear to be one of them, particularly for this period. There may be a copy of it somewhere in the Wellington archives associated with Parliament. But the person who saw the object, their feeling was this. It was not one of fear of the Germans. It was that if that is the explanation that it was a local inventor, concluded our informant, the inventor has struck something that will knock Count Zeppelin and Wilbur Wright sideways. For as I gazed at that grand light sailing easily through space on Sunday night, I involuntarily ejaculated, "My, what would I not give to be on that ship?" It seemed to embody the very poetry of aerial motion. Now, to me, that is not so much the expression of despair as many historians would have you believe. It is really a sense of excitement that something was going on, and the same sort of excitement that many UFO investigators find today when we first go out to talk to people who have had a UFO sighting. Now, I'll finish at that. Thank you very much. I would urge you, if you have an interest, to look up your own newspapers, your own local newspapers at the time in Australia, wherever you're from, particularly from West Australia. You may well find that there are very, very good accounts of airships or early UFOs in them for that period. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian. Today is a firm believer in the possibility and probability of other life in space. Lights up, please. She joined the Victorian UFO Research Society in 1958. She was invited to become president of this same research society in 1978. We are glad she could come here today to tell us more about a very unique an eye-opening close encounter experience, a classic case that is known throughout the worldwide UFO community. Please, welcome now Judy McGee.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. I didn't expect to see the Knowles case on there this morning. We investigated that one, and it was a very interesting and fascinating case. I said in this introduction that I was a firm believer in the probability of life in outer space. My belief in this came when I first joined the organisation in 1958, and I met the Reverend Gill and his friend Reverend Crutwell in 1959. They were in Melbourne at the time, and they'd just come down after this experience. And as you can see there, in the lower part of the picture is Boyanai. That's where the mission station was. There was a loud explosion one day, and they came out to see what had caused the explosion. There were 38 witnesses to an object which was only about 400 feet away from them, and it had 4 entities on it. 2 entities seemed to be working on the object, and then 2 would disappear, and then 2 more would come out, and on the total there were 4 entities on the shelf all at one time. And this, of course, made me believe that this object certainly was not from this planet. It remained there from about 6:45 until 10:30 one evening, and during that period of time there were about 5 or 6 smaller circular objects which came from the clouds and seemed to take up position around the top of the object. And some of these smaller ones would float away and come back again over that period of time. At 10:30 they had all left. Next, please, Andrew. That's his sketch, or an artist's sketch, of what Reverend Gill saw. So you can see the 2 entities there. He was very meticulous too about his documenting of the times, the object's appearance and the entity's appearance and disappearance. But thank you very much, Andrew, sorry. That is the Reverend Gill, and he's pointing to where the mission station was. We'll have the next one too, please. People usually describe objects as from the things that they can recognise, like the natives in New Guinea saying that these looked like Tilly lights to them because they were up in the mountains where they never went to, let alone any white man. And Alexander's armies were dispersed apparently on at least 3 occasions by what they termed flying shields. And a shield, if you recall, has a dome in the middle of it where they hold it with their hands. Thank you, Andrew. I keep calling you Mike for some reason. That's the last one, thank you. My discussion today is a close encounter of Maureen Puddy. Now, Maureen Puddy's case came to my notice through radio, 3AW in Melbourne. I don't listen to radio very often, if I can help it. But on this occasion, some member rang me and said that there had been a lady speaking on the radio for about 3/4 of an hour at that stage, who'd had a close encounter with a UFO. And I spoke to Maureen, and I actually spoke to her for about an hour on the telephone, and I was intrigued by her report. And she promised to come and tell us about it at our general meeting, which she did. We had a full house there, which really surprised her, and the people overflowed out into the foyer. And she started out by saying that, although I'd say at the moment here, these encounters occurred in 1972, but were never written up in our publication until 1983, Review. And Maureen addressed one of our quarterly meetings in 1995, and was attentively accepted, to say the least. It has been said by some researchers who've never even met her that her case was an abduction. But to Paul Norman and myself, who investigated this one rather thoroughly, it was certainly not an abduction, because we were there on the whole of the occasions, especially the third one. Her story began when her son was injured at school when a chest of drawers in the library fell on him and broke his hip. And he'd been taken to the hospital by the Royal Helicopter Angel of Mercy ambulance. And Maureen had just become the president of this service. And while driving home after visiting her son in the hospital, on the 5th of July 1972, she called at her mother's home for a cup of tea and a bit of a chat. And she left there about 9:15 p.m, taking the shortcut along the Muraduck home from Frankston. And that's the south side of Melbourne. I don't know how many of you know that area. It's quite an open area. It's sort of semi-country. And while driving home, on this occasion, she saw a blue light which came down over the car. And she thought it was the helicopter because they have a blue light that blinks on the underside of it. And thinking that the helicopter might have a message for her, she got out of the car and had a look at it. And she was really quite staggered because it was a huge object. It would have spanned the road, that's the macadam strip, plus the two side pieces on the road, which would have made it an extremely large saucer, which would be in about, the object was possibly, in her estimation, about 2 telephone poles high, and would have spanned the strip of road, which was 24 feet wide, also taking in the nature strips on the either side of the road, and making the saucer approximately 100 feet in diameter. Now, having already alighted from the car, she leaned back and took a long look at the object and wondered what it was that she was seeing. The object's surface was smooth. It had no joins or welds, seams or rivets, no windows or portholes, and no wheels. The huge object was radiating a brilliant light or blue light and an intense glow, and there was no movement, no wobbling, no rotating, but a faint humming could be heard. And she noted all these things while wondering what sort of aircraft it was before fear took over, at which time she quickly got back into the car and drove off as fast as she could, only to find the object was maintaining its speed just above and behind the car. No matter how fast she travelled, the object seemed to remain at the same distance. Aware that the blue light was no longer with her, and seeing a very bright light streak off in the opposite direction, Mrs. Putty realised that the chase must have been over. And it followed her for about 8 minutes, or 8 miles rather. She didn't go a mile a minute, but 8 miles. The witness reported her sighting to the police at Dramana, and some family members, and also some friends who considered it all a bit of a joke. So she decided to do a little bit more about it, but not until about 3 weeks later. Then on the 25th of July, and that same year, after having visited her son again, he was there in the hospital for some time, she followed a similar route home, had a cup of tea with her mother, and left again about the same time, 9:15. She arrived at the Muraduck Road, travelled a short distance of about 1 mile when the blue light once again appeared before her. And she thought, oh no, not again. And this time I'm not going to stop. And she was hanging onto the steering wheel and nothing was going to move her from that car. And the car drifted to a stop on the side of the road. No matter what she did to the Holden car, it wouldn't reply to her demands. And she was wondering, where do I go from here? She was rather terrified and gripped the wheel and looked out the windscreen and saw the object hanging silently above the car, just in front of it and above the car. And the countryside was bathed in a blue light. Then a voice spoke to her. Not audibly, she said, but in her head, as if it was a thought put into the head. And as if words had been put into a computer and came out the other end in the most beautifully modulated and very well-spoken English. During this time, she experienced a most unusual sensation. She said if you could feel that you'd been in a vacuum, well, that was the impression that she got. It was perfectly still and perfectly quiet. And the message read, "Don't be afraid," as a pause. "We mean you no harm," another pause. "Your tests will be negative." And she'd already had some done and they were negative, but she thought they couldn't have been the ones. "Tell the media," and a longer pause, "and you are now in control." And at that moment the car started up again as if she had turned the key. Now she didn't touch the key at all, she just sat there, she was stunned. So the car started up because she hadn't turned it off, they had apparently. And she stopped at the same police station to find it closed. Then she went on to the next one, and still on her way home. And she told the police officer that, "I want to report a sighting of a flying saucer." "Oh, yes, madam, yes," came the reply. And she insisted in fear and frustration, so the policeman humoured her and had it recorded. The next morning she phoned Laverton RAAF station and asked if they could offer any explanation of what she'd seen, to which they replied that it couldn't have been an aircraft or a balloon, as neither would have been in the area at the time, but didn't say as it could cause panic, anything that could cause panic. They would send her a questionnaire to complete, but when asked about this later, she said you'd have to have been an astronaut to have understood it, and I believe she didn't bother to return it. But Paul and I were invited to go through the Air Force files, and we discovered that she obviously had returned it at a later date. Must have thought much better of it. Naturally, we questioned Maureen regarding her experience in the car, and what did the messages mean? She said she'd not had any recent tests, but she'd had some about 6 months before, and they had proved negative. There was no use telling her not to be afraid because she was terrified. As for telling the media, she'd phoned 3 or 4 TV stations, and one was mildly interested, and they were showing Chariots of the Gods at the time, and 2 made light of the news, and she didn't bother to contact the 3rd one or the 4th one. And I heard through a radio talkback program, which in desperation she had contacted because the UFO nuts had said to contact the media, and she was not wanting to see them again. UFO naughts, I meant, not UFO nuts. We're the UFO nuts. And at this stage, I'd not actually met Maureen. That was the day I spoke to her on the telephone, and only spoken to her for 1 hour. But when I invited her to address one of our meetings, we had the National Mutual Theatrette at the time, a delightful little theatrette, and she agreed to do this, and we sat her down the front where she couldn't see all the people coming in, and I said, well, you'll be comfortable there and you won't see anybody. So when she got up to speak, she was staggered at the number of people that were filling the hall and outside into the lobby. But that hall was crowded, and it was very, very quiet, right through the whole hour of her talk. And even the people outside who were standing were perfectly quiet. Everybody was thoroughly fascinated. During the period, the question period that time, Maureen was put through her paces. She did think that what she saw was a psychic phenomena. And did she suffer any burns or after effects? To both these questions, the first one was, did she think it was a psychic phenomena? And to both the questions, she answered no. Did she think there were any other witnesses? She thought there must have been one at least, because as she was approaching the railway crossing, she saw a man with a torch leading a car across the railroads, and surely the UFO must have passed it over him, but would have been going in the same direction, so he may not have seen it. Later, the man's wife contacted her, and also another lady living on the ridge, the range ridge there, who'd seen a light coming across the road. Both had seen this. The third experience was purely a psychic experience, and this happened about 6 months later. It was one Wednesday evening. I'd received a phone call from a rather agitated Maureen, who said she'd been trying to contact 2 other representatives. Probably a good thing that she couldn't contact them, because she may have had to have gone public, and I don't think she really wanted that. She was quite happy to speak at our meeting, but not to go public in media or publications. For some days she'd been hearing a voice calling to her, Maureen, return to the meeting place. And it didn't matter where she went, she could hear this voice. She heard it at the front door, and she went to answer the door, and the husband said, who was that? Because the husband was in a wheelchair at this stage. He was an invalid and had been for some time. And she said there was nobody there. She went up shopping and turned around to hear somebody who'd been saying, Maureen, return to the meeting place. And this was getting on her nerves a bit. I think she was getting a little bit worried as she was going shopping that day. And she felt that she had to go to the meeting place and was too scared to go alone. So when she rang my number, I told Paul, and off we both trotted that night. We took our supper with us and went off in his car down to meet Maureen at the meeting place. We said we'd wait to see her at an electrical substation, which was right opposite where we were going to be. And she came along about 8:30 and rather agitatedly dashed over from her car to ours. And we were there, really quite early. It was still, I think, only just light. And she came over, rushing over and saying, "I nearly went off the road back there." And I said, "Well, I suggest you tell us all about it when we drive to the meeting place." So she said that there was, before going further, I should perhaps add that as I entered her car to go away to the meeting place, I had an odd feeling when I touched the electrical experience when I touched the door of her car, and I got a sort of an electric shock, which probably wouldn't have been unusual for me because I thought maybe being somewhere near the substation, it might have had an effect on the car, and touching the metal handle might have had an effect of a slightly electric shock on myself. However, I got into the car and I said, she'd told me that there was a little man sitting there when she'd turned around the corner up there, and I said, "Is he still there?" And I thought, well, if he is, I'm sitting on him. And she said, "No, he went when I got out of the car," when she got out of the car. And I said, "What did he look like?" And and that she was really quite shocked at this. And he got out of the car. He was like a little man, she said, but in a tinsel type suit. He was silvery, and he was described as sitting exactly where I was, which was quite close to her in the middle of the seat, because I thought Paul was going to come in with us, and I'd moved in. But he wasn't there, and I couldn't visualise it. I had no idea. I mean, I might have a very good imagination at times, but it didn't run to that extent. And when we got back to the meeting place, which was a little drive off among some trees, Paul got into the back of her car, and I was sitting in the front with her still. And we were talking about the latest incident when she grabbed my arm and shook me, and she pointed across and she said, "There he is. Can't you see him? And can't you see him?" And she's sitting there shaking me like Billy-O. And I tried to explain to her that it was possibly like closed-circuit television from them to her. And she said he was coming closer to the car. In fact, he was so close that had I put my arm out, I could possibly touch him. And I was edging closer to her because she said that he wanted her to get out of the car. And I said, "Well, come on, I'll come with you." And she wasn't going to get out anywhere. She was hanging onto that steering wheel. She wasn't going to move. So we asked Paul if he would get out of the car, brave Paul, and walk around the car to see what the entity would do. And he did. He was brave enough to do it. And I said to Maureen, "What's the entity doing, Maureen?" And she said, "He's taken a step back to let Paul get between the car and himself." So, and she adamantly declared she still wasn't going to get out of it. So I tried still trying to gently ease her out of the car. Anyway, the entity then became impatient, and he started to walk away or move away and disappeared behind some thin bushes there. And she suddenly commenced describing the interior of the object. She said, "Oh, I'm inside the object." And I said, "Well, what's it like?" And she told us that the entity had been standing there pointing to a large mushroom-like thing, like object in the centre of the circular room. It was a huge circular room, she said. Couldn't see any doors or windows or anything. The centre object, which was taller than an average person, was a bit like a jelly. She said the first part was a bit like a clock, with the Roman numerals all the way around it. And there's another part of it, interior part, which seemed to be moving like a jelly. So I asked her if it was like a gyroscope. And she said, "What's a gyroscope?" Well, we'd asked her that later on, and she had no idea what a gyroscope was, so we went on with this. She said there were like Roman numerals. Apparently, looking around the room, she became very agitated, started to cry, and I put my arm around her shoulder. And she says, "I can't get out, I can't get out. There are no doors or windows. I can't get out." And that was her great fear at the time. She was in this UFO and couldn't get out. She didn't realize she was still sitting there with me. And she was really upset, and I clearly visualized what she was telling us, as if there was a picture in front of us. I knew exactly what she was describing. She said the little man was standing there pointing to this object, and she was watching and didn't take her eyes off it. So I decided, because she was so upset and agitated, that I was getting a bit concerned about her, because I could feel her tears falling down onto my hand, which was around her shoulders. And I directed my thoughts to them, and I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. And I thought, well, you know, I'm fearful for her state of health. If you can help her, please do. And you got her into this state, so get her out of it. And I felt she might have had a nervous breakdown or a stroke or something. She was just so upset. And anyway, they said she said they wanted her to close her eyes. And I said, well, go ahead. And she said, no, I'm not going to close my eyes. And you know, when you blink, you have no idea of blinking, because you do it so naturally. So she obviously blinked, and then I could feel her relax. And she must have gone out into a sort of a trance or a coma or whatever you like to call it. And then she began again to describe the interior of the object, and she still could see no way out, and she was still upset. And after a brief period, she sort of came back to us. She relaxed, and she said, "Oh, I'm back again." And I said to Paul, well, let's have this cup of tea. We had a cup of tea with us, and we'll discuss it further and see what else we can make out of this, and see what she can get, see if Maureen can remember anything extra. So we put the lights on, and we got the thermos flask out and handed Maureen a cup of tea. And she's all of a sudden, even with a cup of tea in her hand, she said, "Oh, I'm back in there again." And she started describing it again and repeated the whole description all over again. And after a little while, she said more calmly, "He's gone." And he's gone this time. I said, "How do you know he's gone?" She said, "The feeling's different. It's gone completely. He's gone. It feels different." So now she came back to normal again. And everything seemed quite normal, so we went on with our supper and discussing the mushroom. And I was trying to identify it because she wasn't very technically minded. And I asked if it was like a gyroscope, but Maureen was apparently unfamiliar with that term. I'd only come into met the term because I was working with an airline, and they took us through all the area where they used to do up the aircraft and go over all these things. So I knew what it was. And she picked up a little gadget off the dashboard and said, "Would this be like it?" And to my astonishment, it was one of those tiny little compasses that people have stuck on their dashboard. And she said that was almost identical to the mushroom that she'd been viewing. And it sticks on this little one sticks on the dashboard, you know, with a suction cup. I hadn't seen one before, and I haven't seen one since. But we didn't let her drive home alone, and she didn't wish to go either on her own, because she was afraid that they might come back again. And she didn't want another visit from her friends, so-called, or the nerves on the part of the drive. She thought she might have had an accident or something. So I drove in her car, and Paul followed us, and we went further down the line, further away from home. And I believe at this time that it was about 10:30 or 11 o'clock when we got down to her home. We didn't really take that much notice of the time, but it was about that time. And of course the events went through the air again. Her husband was there, and we made a cup of tea and sat and discussed it again. And was I able to communicate with the entity when he said to close her eyes? Did I really communicate with them? Did they receive my thoughts regarding her agitated state? This is just our own thoughts after this. If so, what thoughts can they receive from more important and delicate situations than that particular one? Can they transmit to us? Can we transmit to them? I do believe that as science has gone on since those years, of course, naturally, we can communicate a lot more easily with, in so many various ways. And I thought perhaps at this stage that, have you ever watched a hypnotist on a stage, you know, at work when they get a whole lot of people there, and they can either, I can't hypnotise you, or come on, I can hypnotise you, and they get up there and they put them under, as we say. And when I snap my fingers, you will go into a deeper trance, or you'll come out of it, or you'll do such and such a thing. Was this second or third case the time when they snapped their fingers at Maureen Puddy and she went along and went into this so-called trance and visualised the inside of this object? Was the second meeting of that such case in her car just prior to speaking to her, was that the time when they perhaps snapped their fingers then? That if you could be in a vacuum, then I've been in one, such an incident. There was no sound, there was no movement, all was calm and quiet. Then the voice delivered the message. Was the third incident due to the snapping of the fingers when they urged her to act? If this is so, how many people can they hypnotise, I'll put it that way, perhaps in their sleep, so we react when they wish us to, or whenever they snap their fingers? I find this a very sobering thought. Perhaps some of the abductions are the result of this snapping of the fingers by them. Thank you for your attention.
Lights up, please. Our next speaker is well known to all of us here in the Australian UFO community, especially here in New South Wales. He's known for speaking his mind even when we don't want to hear what must be said. Consider this quote from his article in the most recent issue of the UFO Reporter magazine that's available back there at the bookstall. The way UFO investigators go about their research has to change radically. The self-censorship practiced by many UFO groups on their own researchers as to what is an acceptable research direction has severely limited our work. We need to be more accommodating of diverse opinions. We should work openly and as a team. We need to look at all the data fellow researchers can produce for the critical information that we seek. He has been active in UFO organizations since 1973. He served as president of the Australian Centre for UFO Studies from 1985 to 1990. He is also one of the founders of UFO Research New South Wales in 1991, along with Brian Dickinson and Moria McGee, and served as president of this group until just last year. You could say that right now he's taking a bit of a breather, but let me ask you, just how do you let go of the tail of a tiger? Please welcome Paul Sowiak.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or should I say good evening? Or good afternoon, sorry. Well, it's a pleasure to be here as part of this conscious sharing. And I think we'll all agree that this has been a great success and a great conference. And there's been a sharing of information nationally. There are three types of ufologists. There's the investigator, there's the researcher, and there's the theorist. I fall into the third category, which is the theorist side. Ufologists are extraordinary people, unravelling the mysteries of the extraordinary world we live. I'm proud to be part of this awakening of the human mind with my colleagues here before you today as a panel of experts dwelling into the consciousness of man. What is real and what is not? Casnadia de Jon wrote, Tales of Power, that we perceivers of the world, but the world we perceive is an illusion created by the description given to us at birth. And we maintain this illusion through reason and talk. So when we talk about ufology, we're talking about a mystic or a mysterious part of our being. And I think it needs to be understood. As a UFO theorist, I've been investigating the phenomena for the last 23 years and only recently begun to start putting the pieces together to get a greater understanding of the subject. My earliest conference paper last year examined the postulation the human race was created by an alien race. This was confirmed by Linton Newton Howe in her book Alien Harvest, suggesting that we're abducted for genetic material along with cattle. Today I will speak about classes of aliens coexisting with human race in terms of origins, mannerisms and behaviour. Before I start, I'll just say that I've had competing needs for my time in the last week. I'm going on holidays on Monday and unfortunately I backed the camper van into a brick wall. I've had to do a few repairs. Okay, where does one, and I also chased that blimp last night that slowed things down as well. This is straight off the printer about half an hour ago. Where does one start to rediscover the information about alien influences here on Earth? Human history is full of 3, 4, 5 and 6-fingered giants and dwarf people. The Bible is a great history book of such matters. In Genesis 6:4, in those days when the sons of gods had intercourse with daughters of men and had children by them, the Nephilim were on earth. They were heroes of old, men of renown. In Hebrew, giant translates as Raphael. Raphala is the plural, Raphaelism, of uncertain emetology. They were tall, large-framed, powerful. They lived southwest of Jerusalem in Johassa. Various ufologists have tried to classify aliens in lines of classification. I'd like to go to that second overhead, thank you. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, classification of aliens. What they've done is they've looked at it and they said, okay, we're looking at the degree of strangeness. And they tried to look at the physical appearance. Some people looked at the actual clothing they wear and classified them by their clothing. Obviously, the ideal way would be to find out where they came from and classify them by their origin. But that seems a little bit difficult because we're being abducted, not them being abducted by us. Okay, McCall, John D. Heavra and Alvin Lawson in 1977 derived a group or categories of aliens. Human, there. Then you've got your humanoid, basic bipedal shape, head, 2 arms, 2 legs. Then you've got your animal. Then you've got your robot. Then you've got your exotic. And then you've got your apparitions. It's an interesting classification. Could we go to that overhead view? In this next overhead, we've looked at another study that looked at the various types of aliens that have been picked up. And they all seem to have some basic characteristics. As you can see from there, what are they? They're all bipedal. In other words, they've got 2 arms, 2 legs and a head. The humanoid in structure. And our evolutionists suggest that as a consequence of evolution, the eyes come forward, the brain is fairly close to the eyes, and for mobility and dexterity we need arms and we need legs. So that seems to be maybe universal for. Okay, next overhead please. Thanks, Hugh. Okay. MacDonald also looked at the classification system and came up with this scenario. And what we're looking at here is we've got a grey, we've got the Roswell figures, we've got neonate, which is basically infant humanoid shape, then we've got the Nordic group, then we've got the reptilian, and then we've got the hybrid, which is a cross between us and them. Now, when you look at all that, it doesn't seem to make a great deal of sense, and it seems to be a little bit all over the place. But basically it's bipedal, you've got a head, 2 arms and a leg, it's very common. I postulate to combine the groups based on functions and alien strata derived from abduction experiences. Can we go to slide 6, right through that little section please. Okay, my classification, I'm looking at the first class being animal, and the the chupacabras of Puerto Rico would be one that would fit into that category. It was described as large, wet, black, hairy gorilla-like, about 5 foot tall. Does it sound like an animal to you? Yeah, okay. In Babylonian times, you had the Onus, which was a god, and it was basically a fish-tailed humanoid type person, a god. And in Africa, you looked at the Dogon, or from the Dogon group in Africa, the Dogon tribe, fish-tailed. Okay, that's the animal classification. The next group I think we should classify as would be humanoids. And these would include the reptilians and the Nordics, and basically the ones that were fairly similar to... You keep on going with those? Sorry, Andrew. Basically just the humanoid shape, but it seemed to exhibit sort of human or vulnerable characteristics. The next group, well, I considered important, was the human hybrid clones, and the Nordics, would fall into this group. Hybrid clones settle and supervise abductions and take up functions perhaps like psychologists or social workers on board these ships based on some of the information from the abducting experience. That's the sort of abduction scenario we're looking at. Just keep on going with those for that group, if you would, Andrew. Okay, the next group, so after groups, humanoids are broken down into two groups. Humanoids, which is basic, and the hybrid or clones, which is the Nordic group. So we've got 1 animals, 2 humanoids, 3. Now the third classical group would be the androids. And the greys would fit into this sort of classification. And we're looking at beehive control, short-term memory, basic function type units. In other words, robots. And the fourth category is apparitions, or holographic projections. And an example of this would be aliens that have been observed that can't be totally visibly identified or seen, that have a wispy nature about them, that probably don't exhibit any feet. Okay? So the fetal mode of movement is not clear. That's the suggestion that I'm looking at. So there's 4 classifications. You've got animals, you've got humanoids. It's broken down into hybrids and clones. And then you've got the androids or robots, and you've got the apparitions. So you've got basically 4 groups based on what they're on about. What I might do is now go into some of those groups a little bit. So we're looking at the animal class, where we can look at the chupacabras, blood-sucking vampires, creatures from Puerto Rico, Mexico, and South United States of America. They're kin animals and attack humans. The chupacabras is a Spanish word meaning chupa, which is to suck, and cabras, which is goats. So they're basically goat suckers. Well, that's the description from the native nationals that live in those areas. They're described as having 3 toes, 3 fingers, with 50 millimetre long fingernails, and they smell like wet dogs that have been in a sewer. They have small pointed ears, they're thin, patchy spotted hair, and shades of grey and oranges. Now, I suppose you'd all like to meet one of those. On the 11th of March 1995, just more or less recently, at a town of Orquistas, in the centre of an island, Puerto Rico, Ewan Brato Hermendez found 8 of his sheep dead with 3 strange puncture holes in their chest. And there's been reports of human attacks more recently. Okay, the second group, which is class 2. Can we go to slide overhead 17, please? Majestic has come to the fore with Stanton Friedman and others as being a reliable document and evidence that the United States Air Force were doing covert UFO tactical surveillance and retrievals relating to UFO events. And they've classified in their manual, and that's a page from the front of their manual, 2 types of extraterrestrials. And I would put these into the human class, which is category 2. The first one is EBE type 1, and they're humanoids similar to humans in appearance, and could be mistaken for Oriental person. Bipedal, 5 to 5 foot 4 inches in height, weighing 80 to 100 pounds. Similar to human, with slightly larger and more rounded cranium. The skin is pale, chalky yellow in colour, thick, slightly pebbled in appearance. The eyes are small, wide set, almond shape, with brown-black iris with very large pupils. The whites of the eyes are not like that of humans, but have pale grey cast. The ears are small and not low on the skull. The nose is thin and long, and the mouth wider than humans, nearly lipless. There is no facial hair or very little body hair, that being very fine and confined to the underarms and groin area. The body is thin without apparent body fat, but muscles are well developed. The hands are small, 4 long digits, but no opposing thumb. The outside digit is joined in a manner as to be almost nearly opposable. There is no webbing between the fingers as in humans, and the legs are slightly but noticeably bowed, and the feet are somewhat splayed and proportionately large. That's type 1. Type 2, the Air Force classification under Majestic, is that these entities are human but different from type 1. They are bipedal, 3 foot 5 to 4 foot 2 inches in height, and weigh 25 to 30 pounds. The head is much larger than human or type 1. The cranium is much larger and elongated. The eyes are very large, slanted, and nearly wrapped around the side of the skull. They are black with no whites showing. There's no noticeable brow bridge, and the skull has a sleep peak that runs over the crown. The nose consists of 2 small slits, with slits high above the slit-like mouth. There are no external ears. The skin is a pale bluish grey colour. The being's somewhat darker on the back of the creature. It's very smooth and fine cell. There's no hair, no facial body hair, and the creature does not appear to be mammalian, feeding young with breast milk. The arms are long in proportion to the legs, and the hands have 3 long tapered fingers and a thumb that is nearly as long as the fingers. The second finger thicker than others, but not as long as the index finger. The feet are small and narrow, and the 4 toes are joined together with a membrane. Majestic points out that these 2 types of creatures may have originated from different planets. They're fairly substantial classification of people who are occupants of UFOs or associated with UFO activity, and they're fairly significant comments on the different classes. We obviously haven't seen them to do autopsies on, but we are dealing with eyewitness reports that starts to mirror some of that information there, which suggests that it's correct. The third type of, or the second subclass of humanoid I mentioned earlier was the Nordic tall blondes. They're about 6 to 7 feet tall, handsome, blonde shoulders, length hair, with blue eyes, kind and loving. Now this information is coming from abductees. People have been abducted onto flying saucers, and these are their stories. Now they may not be totally correct, but in essence they must be getting roughly around the right information. And the consistency between reports, so we're starting to build some pictures. He is parental, watchful, smiling and affectionate, youthful, all-knowing, and wears tight-fitting uniform, a guardian angel. Usually seen with small greys. They have vivid blue eyes and seem to look alike. The small beings mentioned before, the skin is reported to be soft and poreless, with rubbery or plastic feel to it. The tall being's skin is rough and more leathery. Neither type of being has hair, muscular skeletal, and distinguishing marks like warts or moles or discoloration are not seen. Abductees describe alien skin colour in varying shades of grey, from dark grey to chalk white. Tall beings have an air and authority about them. Maybe they represent some sort of hierarchy within aliens, such as a doctor or psychologist on board these ships. The small beings appear to be controlled by them. Okay, the next group, which are the androids. Now, the most typical android, I believe, that is seen by abductees is the grey. I don't believe the grey is a humanoid. I believe it is a part robot, part animal type android is the word I'm looking for. And if you look at the behaviour of them, they never run, they never get excited, they're very cool, they just do their job and their functions, and when things get into trouble or there's a problem, a taller being comes in and controls the situation, as we saw at the Kelly Cahill. Number 18, please. Okay. And other examples would be the Hopkinsville Kelly sighting, where we saw this sort of frog-like humanoid with the big ears. Now that was reported as being silvery, so that's probably a robot. And Pascagoula is also an unusual shaped one. Could you go to number 19, please? We're looking at aspirations or holographic projections. We're looking at a different group. We're looking at them disappearing from view, not as walking or being beamed up, but actually decreasing or dematerialising is that group there. Now obviously we can go into a lot more history about where they come from and what they're doing, but we don't have time to deal with that today. I will be writing a book on this particular subject, and it should be out within the next 12 months, so you can hold me to that. And we'll be looking at these particular issues a bit more carefully. So in conclusion, I'd just like to make a comment about Paddy Barton's statements and paper yesterday. The Copernican revolution was 1543, where man moved away from his concept of the centre of the universe. I do not want to work backwards, to move backwards towards a centralised universe where we think we're the centre of the universe. Holograms exist. It's the composite of intellectual life manifestations of the universe, not just the planet Earth and humanoids. The Earth is being visited and coexistence with aliens ever since time began. Human awareness in 1990 has finally realised their presence. Where they be extra or intra-terrestrial or dimensional beings, we are not alone. May the force be with you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Paul. Our next speaker will continue where this film ended by expanding on the relevance of channeled information to UFO research. He has been active in Queensland UFO organizations since the late 60s. He is currently the administrator for Australia's only, and to my understanding, true national UFO organization, ACUFOS. His vision is to somehow make this ACUFOS a part of all existing UFO groups in this country now, in order to maintain, protect, and make available all the UFO research and records gathered to everyone concerned. A kind of free national UFO database, if you will. This vision is yet to be realized. How can he not have our support? Please welcome Martin Gottscho.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think what I'm going to speak about today is really more in the field of the philosophy of UFO research. That is to say, when we step back and look at all the things we've been trying to do and ask ourselves, are we going about this in the best possible way? And we step back and say, while we've been busy accusing of the rest of the world of denying the facts and ignoring the facts and not seeing the inferences and implications, do we not sometimes do the same thing ourselves? For after all, we're part of the same community and we share the same shortcomings as the people whose shortcomings we see so very clearly. And so it is that in conferences and gatherings like this one, channeled material and the accounts of contactees tend not to get too much attention. I think part of the stated reason for this is it's two-way out for the other side of the society that we want to attract, the scientists and the general run of the public that we want to get our messages out to. We don't dare to be that way out. But I think there's also an unspoken agenda too. It hurts to stretch the mind that far. It opens chasms and fears and uncertainties, and we are human beings as well as researchers, and we're subject to our failings as well. So I hope that in addressing this topic of channeled material, I can, both myself and all of us, help all of us to see a little more clearly why we've taken our particular stance in UFO research and how perhaps we might improve on it. I'm not here to tell you that channeled material is true or real or accurate. That is not, I think, for a UFO researcher to determine. We have our own questions to answer, as I'll point out. So what is channeled material, or what is channeling? It's one aspect of a broader category of information, sometimes called received information, in which an individual somehow switches off their consciousness to such a degree that another consciousness allegedly is able to communicate through the communication equipment of that person, be it automatic writing or the voice faculties of that individual. That's the theory of channeling. And I'm not here to tell you that this is true or not true. It's not really quite relevant to my concern here. But I think that's a fair definition of what channeling is understood to be. A classical case is of a person who is confronted by a group of people like this one and sits down in a chair and makes a few jerky movements and a few other sounds and then appears to be in a different state of consciousness. When questions are put, the answers coming claim to be from a different consciousness than that of the person sitting there. And often, I think many people accept that as being the fact that those answers are really coming from a different intelligence than the one associated with the individual whom they see. That's channeled material. I looked at channeled material quite carefully about 20 or 25 years ago. As I think all of us do at one point or another, we look at everything to see what might be learned from it. And my finding about it were roughly that there is an enormous amount of material of this kind around. You can get it by the bookload. I have that much in shelving of it, and I didn't even try to collect it all. I just looked at some. And some of it, to me, was very profound. A small portion of the channeled material is what I would call of a high quality. The ideas are profound, the motivation of the source seems to be of a high moral order, etc. The attention to detail, the attention to truth seems to be genuine, and so on. I would call that of a high quality. The bulk of channeled material, in my finding, tended to be recycled, that is to say, a repetition of something which you could find in print somewhere else from an earlier time. When channeled information makes predictions, those predictions are just as bad as predictions made by almost everyone else. They usually fail at the critical time. And we've had examples of this just in the last couple of years. So the ability to make predictions that are fulfilled by subsequent historical experience doesn't establish channeling as accurate or reliable to a large degree, no more so than most other forms of prediction. But typically, a channeled body of material has a well-defined worldview. It paints a clear picture. Forget for the moment if that picture is true or false, real or not. It's clear. I don't think if I were the channeler here speaking to you, I'd hold your attention for very long if I couldn't project a well-defined story of some kind, give you a clear world view of some kind. And I want to draw on this latter feature most especially when I look at how channeled material might be applied in UFO research. Before doing so, I'd like to briefly give what I think is a good definition of what UFO research is. I think it's fair to say that most UFO researchers take the view that the UFO phenomenon is at least to some extent physically real, has a physical reality to it. Too many people have bumped into them and kicked them and been bumped by these things, either the UFOs or its occupants, for that not to be a reasonable premise. That does not mean, of course, that they are only real in the sense that we understand physical reality. We are simply saying that whatever else they may be, they also can behave like physically real objects, and therefore the methods of research that have worked well for us in studying other physically real things like nature and the physical world have a relevance to UFO research. And I think in any research practice, it is very important to distinguish facts from inferences. We need both to understand a phenomenon. What we tend to do, and the thing that we always have to guard against doing, is to judge what can be fact by whether or not it agrees with what we think the world is like, our inferences. I think the early history of UFO research came up very hard against this particular problem. When UFOs displayed the physical characteristics they did, the apparent weightlessness, the tremendous changes in speed and direction at very high inferred accelerations, the first reaction of the most qualified people was, this is physically impossible, therefore that can't be a true factual statement. It doesn't fit my theories, so it can't be a fact. We're still probably up against... We're probably still up against that to a large degree, or perhaps less so than before. So as UFO researchers, we have to guard carefully against judging facts by our theories or our beliefs about what is real or true. We have to have a methodology for letting facts speak for themselves, for deciding what is a fact on the merits of the factual side of it, while our theoretical thinking is switched off for the time being. And then when we've done that, then we try to assimilate the facts into some kind of a conceptual framework by a process which no longer is worried about whether facts are facts or not, but accepts them for the moment as facts and says, well, what sense can I make of it? So we do this, just like we have 2 feet and we stand on one while we take a step with the other, then we put that one down and stand on it while we take a step with the next one. Rather so do we do the fact gathering and the interpreting stepwise. And when we're doing one, we're not doing the other. And if we try to do the 2 together, we'll trip and fall. It's a bit like that with UFO research as well. So that's the kind of thing I think we all do in one way or another. And that, in fact, is essentially what is called the scientific method, or shall we put it the other way around? As science became established and grew, scientists adopted this method, which existed before science ever had a name, as a good way of studying the natural world. And I don't think there's any arguments about that. It is a proven method. It works quite well if we do it the right way. Okay, well, that's UFO research as I understand it. And now I can address the question of what can we do, or what can we use channeled material for in furthering our attempts to understand the UFO phenomenon. And in this respect, I think it's fair to say that channeled material does not contribute very much of a factual kind. There isn't much of a factual kind in the channeled body of information. Some that there is may be difficult to establish factually. If there is, we apply the normal rules of factual analysis to it, let the facts stand on their own. If they come out of that test okay, we'll take it as fact. We don't have that much of it. What we have in the channeled body of material is a lot of ideas and concepts and belief systems. And just because they're that kind of stuff is no reason to ignore them. because we need ideas and concepts and belief systems in order to make sense of the body of facts that we have associated with the UFO phenomenon by a careful process of assessment, categorizing, truth-finding, and so on. But they're just a great big pile of facts until we make sense of them, and we need a conceptual framework with ideas, notions, theories, and so on, with which to order them into something that might be an explanation of the things we don't know. We're trying to go from the things we know as facts to the things we don't know by this process of inference. And then we think we've made some sort of progress. We say we have developed some kind of understanding of this phenomenon. Okay, so it is in the field of ideas and concepts that channeled material can be the most helpful. And I would like to illustrate this by making reference to a particular sample of channeled material. You've been looking here at this picture. It was published in something called The Voice of Universarius, which I received. I became a subscriber to that publication. It was produced in the United States between the early 1970s and through most of the 70s. And I also obtained some back copies of their publication because I was keen to complete my collection of what they were printing. This picture refers to Clarion. Clarion is a planet described by a contactee called Bertram Russell. His experience, to my knowledge, happened in the 50s, early or middle 50s. He was working with the road gang, building roads in the western desert of the United States. I forget the exact place right now. During the hot days, a lot of the work, especially maintenance work, was done at night. So he would work maintaining the vehicles and machinery, and when he had what was a lunch break at midnight or thereabouts, he'd drive off into the desert to have his lunch, in inverted commas. And on these occasions, he saw a large object land, he saw little beings come out of it. He had a repeated series of such sightings and encounters with the occupants, and became quite friendly with the lady captain that drove this thing. They were smallish type beings, who said she came from a planet called Clarion, which was beyond the moon. That's the only description she gave of it, and was a place we couldn't see with our telescopes. I believe that's what the word Clarion here refers to. And those of you who have read Alec Newell's recent book called Co-Evolution may recognize a faint similarity between the diagrams in his book and the artwork in this picture. Has anyone seen that, read that book of Newell's? Anyone here? One? Oh, there's a few. Do you notice a similarity with the structures he shows on this world that he says he went to, and some of the images here? I certainly picked it up. And I thought you might be interested to see it. Now, this thing was published in 1978. The channeled message that I'm going to use as reference, if I may have the next slide, please, was first produced, or the claimed dating of it is 1967. I'll give you the date here. The communication was given in March 1967 to a person called Marian Hartill. And the claimed source of this communication was Myron of the Ashtar Command. Now, you've all heard of the Ashtar Command. Did you know that it was popular in the 1960s? If you didn't, then you haven't realized how much recycled material you're getting in channeled sources. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily false. If the Ashtar Command is real, it's probably been around for a long time. I'm not concerned here to evaluate the truth or not of channeled material, but just to look at it. Okay, the Ashtar Command's been around for a long time. Now, look at that. The title of this particular message is Guidelines of Space Contact. The guidelines of space contact are these. I've also included on that page the source from which I got it. Notice it's The Voice of Universe Sirius. The person editing and publishing it was an elderly gentleman called Zelram Carlsley, whom I met in 1980 in Portland, Oregon. This particular issue was number 17 of October, volume 17 of October 1978. And notice that they've been going for 17 years at that point. Number 10, of course, is for the 10th month. These are monthly issues. I don't have time to go through all of them in detail. I wish to make specific reference to paragraph number 6, which is on the next slide, please. Let's just look at that one. Paragraph number 6. The earth is a battleground. The forces of evil employ ships of great size and beauty, just as do the Christ forces. Now, you may recall that in the 50s and 60s, the Space Brothers were all benevolent, wonderful, beautiful beings. In the 1990s, there are no Space Brothers of benevolent, wonderful inclination. They're all baddies. You know, we sort of swung from one extreme to the other. But in 1967, somebody was saying there are both kinds. And you can't tell the difference by seeing how lovely the spaceships are. Number 2, unprepared Earthlings who seek contact must not do so without knowledge of how to set up a positive force field and hold it around themselves. In other words, don't just rush into a contact, protect yourself first. Is that bad advice in today's context? Next item. The negative forces can and do abduct thousands of people each year off the surface of the earth, as well as animals, water and vegetation. Now, we knew a fair bit about that then. We know a lot more about it today. These samples are used for a hideous purpose. The source here didn't think that abductions, or what we today call the various genetically related procedures that seem to be associated with abductions, are necessarily for a very nice purpose. And a lot of people today don't think so either, and I count myself as one of them. I have serious moral qualms about the whole thing. I don't think nice people do the sort of things that we learn about. Now, this was available in 1967. I don't think it's much out of date today. It's extremely up to date, I think. And it illustrates that we can profit by taking notice of some of the better quality channeled material. I'm not saying we should believe it or necessarily accept it as true. Just be aware of the ideas, because then when the facts come your way that those ideas might help you to make sense of, you'll take a lot less time to make the connection. That's the kind of thing I'm saying. That's the kind of use that I would suggest we make of channeled material. So we're not trying to decide if they're genuine or not, if the alleged source is real or not, if they have an ulterior motive or if they're honest or not. These are important questions. If channeling is the very center of your involvement and interest, these are issues that you'd have to deal with. If you're concerned with unraveling the UFO phenomenon and having a look at channeled information because it seems to be talking about the UFO phenomenon too, or for any reason at all, you're really using it as a source of ideas and concepts. Maybe somebody has thought of something you didn't think of. Or maybe somebody is trying to get a message through all the noise and is using this particular avenue for doing it. Maybe I and each of us have a particular mental block and one particular avenue of communication can get past it. I think that's probably where I can conveniently stop. The conclusions that we can draw from this are, as I've suggested, that we could profitably look at least a better quality channeled material, and that we can always remind ourselves that doing UFO research is like walking down the street. We gather facts and we make sense of them. We gather more facts, we make more sense of them. And while some of us might specialize in one field and others specialize in the other field, we have to do both. in order to gain our understanding, the understanding that we, I believe, are seeking for. Thank you very much.
For the delay, I'd like to present the next speaker to you. He's going to be giving us the real facts behind a case that, of course, is very well known to all of us here and actually to everyone around the world that studies these things. It's the case of a pilot that went missing in midair and was never seen or heard from again. Here to give you the real story behind young Frederick Valentic is a longtime UFO investigator. He continues his research as public relations officer for the Victorian UFO Research Society and also as a Victorian representative for MUFON. We thank him for coming all the way here to join us today and present this to you. Please welcome Paul Norman.
In December 1959, the Inspector General of the U.S. Air Force issued a directive to the command stating that unidentified flying objects treated lightly by the press and referred to as flying saucers are serious business. In serious business indeed, because there have been many people who have lost their lives and in the pursuit investigation of unidentified flying objects. Before I get on to the Valentic case, I'd like to give you a couple of examples. Kinross Air Force Base, November 1953. There was an unknown spotted from the air base at Kinross. They had one interceptor, and they scrambled that interceptor, who vectored it into the proximity of the UFO. The Captain Felix Monclay and his witness, Lieutenant Wilson, described the object as a cigar shape spinning. As they moved closer to the object, first there was static, and their communication failed altogether. And then there's the MiG jets. At the listening station off Key West in February 1967, the listening station picked up the voices of two pilots out of Cuba flying MiG jets. The first pilot radioed the base back in Cuba that there was an unknown, a cigar-shaped object, and he was instructed to challenge for identification, which he did. Of course, no response. The next instruction came from Cuba was to fire on the object, which he did. When he fired on the object, the cigar shape just went a circle, come alongside. There was no cannon fire. The MiG jet just disintegrated. What was going on was the pilot in the second craft was screaming back to the base in Havana. We don't know what happened to the second jet, but although this case happened back years ago, in 1994, I went to the Key West and checked with some contacts who confirmed this. And just recently, Frederick Valentic was the 20th case that we know about. We've always said there'd be an X number we didn't know about, but we found out about two more. I found became personally acquainted with an investigator who investigated wrecks for crashes for the U.S. Navy. But this was a case that he had investigated. It was a UFO case. And I hope that we can be able to tell you more about this case when the conference in October in Melbourne. We're not in the clear yet. We don't want to get anybody's tail in the crack. Now, Frederick, next slide, please. Next one. During the evening of October 21st, 1979, 20-year-old Australian pilot Frederick Valentic disappeared over Bass Strait while flying from Melbourne's Moorabbin Airport to King Island off the coast of Victoria. He He lost communication. His last communication occurred at 7:12 p.m. during the largest UFO flap in Australian history. Nearly 19 years after that fatal Saturday evening, no trace has ever been found of either the pilot or his blue and white Cessna Model 182 aircraft. During my travels and correspondence, I found many false stories circulating around the world regarding this most important case. I have found that these inaccurate statements are coming from individuals at home and abroad. There are people who live thousands of kilometers from the scene where the action took place, newcomers to the field, and last but not least, professors of impossibility from the scientific community who have concocted preconceived opinions and have tried to make their facts fit around them. Frederick Valentich was not the only person who reported a strange object over and near Bass Strait that day and night. Researchers have found over 50 reported observations in that area which occurred before, during, and after his encounter. Most of this information would never have been found without the diligence of researchers from the Victorian UFO Research Society based at Moorabbin, near the location from whence this mysterious flight commenced. The Bass Strait flap had been building up for over 6 weeks prior to the pilot's disappearance. The UFO flap reached a peak that very weekend of October the 21st. Most daytime sightings were reported more that day and night than any flap period that we have ever investigated. Many of these reports have been published in the BUFOR's publication, Australian UFO Bulletin, the MUFON UFO Journal, and International UFO Reporter, and other publications throughout the world. It is a confirmed fact that many UFOs were reported in the vicinity of King Island and the area around Bass Strait on that day and night. 2 months prior to that fateful event, we were receiving increasing telephone calls from individuals reporting strange light in the sky. About this same time, UFO reports were being passed on to the police and the King Island News. We were not aware of the reports occurring on this island until they were forwarded to us after news of the pilot's disappearance became known. On that same day and night, something strange was taking place in the Melbourne and Victorian skies as well as over Bass Strait. This is an inescapable conclusion from startling files of evidence compiled by individuals in the vicinity, documented interviews with people from unrelated locations up to 300 kilometers apart, told similar stories of round objects, starfish-shaped objects, and silver cigar-shaped UFOs moving slowly in the sky, apparently with no visible means of propulsion and no sound. Can we have the next slide, please? This is a lighthouse that he didn't pass over the lighthouse. He turned 6 kilometers this side of that lighthouse when he picked up his heading for Tasmania. We have witnesses who were vacationing along the Parker River who confirmed that that is where he turned. The transcript position of the communication between Valentich and Melbourne Flight Service as released by the Australian Department of Transport follows. Next slide, please. This will give you an idea where he was. 7:06, Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. Is there any known air traffic below 5,000? Flight service, no known traffic. Frederick, seems to me a large aircraft below 5,000. Flight service, what type of aircraft is it? Frederick, I cannot confirm. It is 4 bright, it seems to me like landing lights. Flight service Delta Sierra Juliet. Frederick, the aircraft has just passed over me at least 1,000 feet above. Flight service, and it is a large aircraft, confirmed. Frederick, unknown, they were both getting uptight at this stage, sort of stuttering along. Unknown due to the speed it's traveling is that any aircraft in the vicinity. Flight service, no known aircraft in the vicinity. Frederick, it's approaching now from the due east toward me. Flight service, Delta Sierra Juliet. Open microphone for 2 seconds. Frederick, it seems to me that he's playing some sort of game. He's flying over me at 2-3 times at speeds I cannot identify. Flight service, Roger, what is your actual level? Frederick, my level is 4,500, 44500. Flight service, and you confirm you cannot identify the aircraft? Frederick, affirmative. Flight service, Roger, stand by. Frederick, it's not an aircraft, it is an open microphone for 2 seconds. Flight service, can you describe the aircraft? Frederick, as it's flying past, it's a long shape, open microphone for 3 seconds. Cannot identify more than it has such speed, open microphone for 3 seconds. It's before me right now, Melbourne. Flight service, Roger, and how large would the object be? Frederick, Melbourne, it seems that it is stationary. What I'm doing right now is orbiting, and the thing is just orbiting on top of me. It's a green light and sort of metallic light. It's all shiny on the outside. At this stage, the object was orbiting with him. We did not know which direction he was orbiting, turning. We found later, which I'll come to at that time. Flight service, Delta Sierra Juliet. At 7:10, open microphone for 3 seconds. It's just vanished. Flight service, Delta Sierra Juliet. Frederick, would you know what kind of aircraft I've got? Is it a military aircraft? Flight service, confirm her aircraft just vanished? Frederick, say again. Flight service, is the aircraft still with you? Frederick, open microphone for 2 seconds. Now approaching from the southwest. Flight service, Delta Sierra Juliet. Frederick, Delta Sierra Juliet, the engine is rough idling. I've got it, it's set at 23, 24, and the thing is coughing. This is a common characteristic of the ignition systems when aircraft are near automobiles, aircraft, power lines, TVs and all. What are your intentions, Frederick? Our intentions to go to King Island. Melbourne, the strange light is hovering again, on top of me again. Open microphone for 2 seconds. It is hovering and it's not an aircraft. Flight service, Delta Sierra Juliet. At 7:12:28, Frederick, Melbourne, open microphone for 17 seconds. No official conclusions has been given for the strange sound which was heard that interrupted the last statement of the pilot. The Valentis counter is almost a carbon copy of an experience of a 4-man crew aboard an Army helicopter who encountered a frightening event on 18th October 1973. This was 5 years before the Valentis case. Captain Lawrence Coyne was flying near Mansfield, Ohio, at 2,500 feet when a crew member notified the captain that an object was approaching on a collision course. Coyne then initiated a controlled descent to 1,700 feet. The UFO took up a position just ahead of the helicopter which was flying at 100 knots. The pilot was amazed. His helicopter was climbing even though his controls were in ascending position. At 3,500 feet, there was a bump when the helicopter broke loose, and we think this is because the rotor on top, after he put the pressure on the control system. During this period, Coyne tried to contact airfields nearby, but both UHF and VHF frequency had failed. Coyne also reported that his compass was rotating slowly. I met him in 1981 at a conference in Cleveland, Ohio, and he explained this. His compass was just spinning slowly, electromagnetic effect again. The shape of the object was described as cigar, as long shape, and his maneuverability was identical to the one reported by Valentich. The instruments were later checked out at Cleveland and found to be satisfactory. In this case, Larry Coyne and his crew got back to tell about the experience. Frederick Valentich did not. We know that up to this stage, it was an identical description of the object that Frederick was describing. While military and civilian aircraft searched the area over Bass Strait, U4's investigators concentrated their effort with the interviews of witnesses who had reported objects they had seen flying that same day and night. Some examples of reports follow. Names are in file with U4s. Curry Island, 2 p.m. The sky was clear except one large cloud directly overhead. Out of this cloud came an object similar to a huge golf ball, about the quarter size of the moon. The object was white or silver in color. It moved slowly to the west toward the sea in the direction from which it came, then returned the direction in which it came. At that time, there was no wind. The cloud remained stationary. The UFO was the only object seen to be moving in the sky. No balloons are released at King Island on the weekends. Beginning less than 1 hour after the King Island UFO was seen, twin cigar-shaped objects were reported to be moving from west to east over Victoria near Bass Strait. They were at least seen about 4:30 p.m., or last seen rather, about 4:30 p.m., and when suddenly they changed color from silver to white, made a sweeping curve to the north and sped away. The movement of these objects was traced by interviewing witnesses scattered along the flight path until the objects sped away. The objects nearest to the UFOs were almost directly under the object. That is, the observers were almost directly beneath the objects. They described them to be about 3/4 the size of a Boeing 747 aircraft joined together with two silver beams. They were last seen over Bass Strait, and there's one area there in between Bass Strait, Cape Otway, that some lads had a possum up a tree. It's the only reason they saw it was they were watching the possum. At 6:45, just 21 minutes before Frederick Valentich radioed Melbourne Flight Service that he was encountering an unknown aircraft, Roy Manifold of Melbourne photographed a 35 film on 35 millimeter film, an object hurling in a blur of speed and mist out of the water near Cape Otway Lighthouse. All modes of computer analysis were used to gain data, including edge enhancement, color and contouring, digiting. The analysis was made by GSW. That's the person there was an engineer who worked in the aerospace industry. He had high technology equipment. William H. Spaulding was his name. The photos were also seen by other photo specialist. Next slide, please. You'll notice here the island, the reef rather, in the back. Nothing there. The next slide, please. In the fourth, you see something bobbing up and down here. And in the next slide, please, what you see here is it looks like a cloud here, but going in 20 seconds, it's going into the shot 9 degrees into the shot, which meant it had to be going over 300 kilometers an hour. Now, publication of the photos brought professors of impossibility out of their armchairs for another debunking attempt. They decreed that the photos showed a cloud or a puff of smoke. Bufor's advisor quickly exploded this hasty announcement. The object appears only in 2 of the 6 pictures taken while the camera was in automatic sequence. Now, the next slide. I took these to the United States to be investigated. The age enhancement, it shows the picture at the disc at the top. This other is missed. And the next slide, please. This is an enlargement of the actual object itself. Now, this was not the same shape object that Valentius was describing. He was describing one of larger shape. This was the smaller one. And the second, next slide, please. You can see the drops, the other enhancement, the drops of water. You can back up on that other slide forward. We'll proceed. Communication between Valentius and Melbourne Flight Service was recorded from 7:06 to 7:12 p.m. before an unexplained sound abruptly terminated the voice communications. During that time, 20 people located in different areas around Bass Strait observed a green light in the same direction at the same time. The pilot was reported the approach and description of an object with a green light. In addition, other reports which have been forthcoming, such as the southern suburb of Frankston, a mother and 4 teenagers reported what appeared to resemble a skyrocket, although the object was stationary. The color appeared to be a mixture rather of red, pink, and white. The witnesses estimated the object to be a quarter the size of the moon. The mother said that at the time of the sightings, she did not realize it was a UFO until later when she learned that other people had seen a strange object. At the same time, a bank manager and his wife was driving on the highway near west of Melbourne, observed a starfish-shaped object out over Bass Strait. They noticed green flickering lights at the ends. The couple is of the opinion that it was the same object that Valentius was reporting before the strange sound jammed the radio transmission. Another sighting was reported from Ormond, a suburb of southern Melbourne, occurring at 7:15 p.m. when lights were noted in a cigar-shaped arrangement.
Yes, we're just about ready to do our first draw of the day for our lucky members' ship numbers. First one out for this draw.
The lights were described as
Membership number 6494. 6494. Remember, if you have one of these numbers as your membership number, you have $50 cash. Or if you unscramble your number, each one of the numbers, $20 cash. Next lucky number out, 5795. 5795. Third number, 5749. 5749. Fourth number, 3183. 3183. The fifth number, 2488. And the last number, 1788. 1788. Those numbers again. First one out was 6494. Then 5795. 5749. 3183. 2488. And the last one was 1788. If you have one of those numbers as your membership number, or can unscramble your number, each one of the numbers, simply bring your card up to the side of the room at the moment in the members' lounge, where all the rapid display will be set up, and Vic will pay you out that cash.
Was it?
Another draw in about 15 minutes' time, and our chip bottle today at 3 o'clock. The rapid tickets
Sorry, folks, we didn't realize they do that. They're turning it down now. Won't happen again. We'll continue here with Mr. Norman in just a moment. There we go. Sorry about that. Go ahead, sir.
Was this deliberate?
Come on now. Not everything's a conspiracy.
There were many other similar reports of flying objects throughout southern Victoria during that same day and night, and they continued for several days following this strange encounter. These reports were being referred to Viewforce from various sources. An outstanding sighting was reported on Monday evening. This period of activity continued even after he had disappeared. 23rd October 1978, only 2 days later. It occurred at 9 o'clock p.m. as two families were preparing to leave the beach. They saw a cigar-shaped light speeding low over Port Phillip Bay from the direction of Bass Strait. When it reached a position about halfway across the bay between the observers, well, anyway, it flashed from south to north, and in a few seconds, these two families who were leaving the beach at the time, it was about dusk, when it got between them and Williamstown across, it flashed, and a red object came from it, moving slowly, although the cigar shape shot south to north just a few seconds. The red object came slowly over the beach where the people were leaving, and it hovered over a little town called Baxter for a few seconds and then sped away toward Bass Strait. Now, one of the best indications from the observers that a UFO was involved came a few days later when two nieces of their uncle would visit them down at Cape Otway, and also his son. And one of the nieces looked up and said, "Uncle, what is the light up there?" He looked up and saw the airplane lights. And she said, "No, I mean the green light above it." Now these people all around Bass Strait and along the Great Ocean Road saw the light, but they were too far away to see the object. And even the airplane, they knew there were airplane lights because he was the only one flying in that area. But the object, Frederick at that time, was approaching from the southwest. Now you recall that when I said he was orbiting and the object was orbiting with him, he was orbiting to the right, turning to the right. His intentions were to go on to King Island. And I know if I'd have been the pilot, all this tension going on, I would have headed back to the lighthouse to pick up my bearings. Now, if the researchers, the search and rescue, had known this, they wouldn't have spent their time down halfway between Apollo Bay and King Island. They would have, if he had a crash, they would have searched the area where he was. Now, my conclusions, the Frederick Valenti's encounter provides an excellent case for study. It is an accident that we can compare with several other encounters where objects have revealed similar characteristics such as a magnetic effect, ignition failure, and as well as communication failure. There is no doubt in my mind that the disappearance of Frederick Valenti and his Cessna was caused by UFO. I do not know whether he went up, down, or disintegrated. The electromagnetic effect from the UFO may have stalled his engine, since he did report the engine was rough island or coffin, and caused him to crash into the water. There is also the possibility that the mystery sound, which ended transmission between Melbourne Flight Service and the pilot, was the sound of his aircraft in the early stages of disintegration. Another possibility that the radio frequency may have been jammed deliberately by persons or entities. Now, I'd like to point out that these poor people didn't come forward at that time because they were fear of ridicule, the ridicule barrier. spearheaded by skeptics. And I'll give you a case of another one by explanation from the skeptics. It's really retarding UFO research. It occurred when a plane was flying over a outback town when 10 witnesses viewed these objects. There were 7 flying in formation. They circled that plane and left the area within 3 minutes. The skeptics' explanation of this, what these objects were migrating pelicans. Now, ladies and gentlemen, to have circled an aircraft and left the area in 3 minutes, they would have had to have been supersonic pelicans, completely equipped with boosters, afterburners, and asbestos feathers. I'm sorry this interruption. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, audience. I'm here today to speak about sightings that have happened in the Southern Highlands, but first I'd like to give you some lucky door prize numbers. Only kidding. First thing you need before you actually have reports to investigate is sightings that need to come in. Now, the main reason why I approached UFO Research New South Wales with the name of a Southern Highlands initiative is because for 3 years prior to April 97 we'd received 1 report, and I'm quite sure that there's more than 1 report of UFO sightings in the Highlands during that period. So what needs to happen is that people need to understand that the UFO phenomenon is not something that occurs only at Stonehenge or only around Area 51 or other exotic areas of Australia. The UFO phenomenon is something that happens in all our communities, be they the Canterbury Bankstown community, the Southern Highlands community, Gosford, Blue Mountains, Broken Hill, wherever. How many people in the audience have either had a UFO sighting of some description or know someone in their community who has? They put their hands up. Just have a look around, ladies and gentlemen, and just see how many people in their own communities have had people that have had UFO sightings or have had them themselves or know people who have. It's very important to establish this, especially to areas that haven't had a lot of this sort of function or information or input happening, where people do feel alone. It's quite common for people to when they do ring up and find that there is someone to talk to. As Mike said, there's a great feeling of relief because a lot of these people don't even feel comfortable in talking to their workmates or friends, especially when in regard to the strangeness of the sighting. It's quite okay to go to your workmates, perhaps in some cases, and say that you saw a strange light behaving when you took the garbage out at 9:30 last night in the sky, and they might have a stab at it and this, that and the other, and then they'll have a joke about it being a UFO, and that'll be the end of it. But if you go out and say, well, I was putting out the garbage and this would have been about 100-foot diameter, I'd say, big glowing lights around the outside, it's hovering about 20 metres above the house, people are just going to not believe you. There's all sorts of effects that can have, as well as constant derision that you might get from friends or workmates. There's other factors as well that come into it as far as employment opportunities and all sorts of things that people worry about. This is becoming this situation is not becoming or is becoming a lot better as the years go by. A lot of the speakers have spoke about the ascendance of our consciousness, and that perhaps this is the UFO phenomenon is part of that journey and our ascendance to a higher level of understanding and higher level of consciousness. Be it a higher level of information that's being given out, or whether that is indeed the fact, I think either way there is an increased awareness of the UFO phenomenon, and it's making people come out and speak about it more. And I think that in the Southern Highlands, for instance, when we took this initiative to re-energise the Southern Highlands, in the short period from April of this year, so that's only a case of about 3 months, we've received over a dozen reports, and yet in the previous 3 years we've received one. Now, there was a combination of not only a conference of this kind, a smaller scale conference of this kind at Mittagong, but also I was very lucky to have the support of the local press, who did about 5 articles, and radio stations, what have you. The idea of this is that there are a lot of people within the community, within all our own communities, wherever we are, that have these stories, and they're not coming out. And that makes this whole understanding of the UFO phenomenon that much more difficult. And also it is very much, I think, a service to a lot of people who, certainly, I mean, one woman who rang me had a sighting in 1973, and she basically hasn't, or the few times she has tried to discuss the sighting with other people, she's met with ridicule, and it's been bottled up inside her since 1973. And the only other person that she had with us was her father, who moved to Queensland. She didn't get along with very well. So, and it's a case of getting on the phone and saying, yeah, I saw that in the article, and then an hour and a half later, it's like a Camorra where they've actually managed to speak to someone about it who's willing to put forward ideas and theories about what that was likely to be. So moving on from there, once we've established that we have the vehicle for information, and that is the general public, just as an aside, at the meeting we invited the police to come and speak, which they agreed to do at the Mittagong meeting we had. And speaking to the police, the inspector there, chief inspector there, he said that we both have a lot in common in as far as that we both rely entirely on the public, and without the public we are nothing. The police use the media, as UFO organisations do use the media, to reach out to people and say, look, we'd like to know about this or we'd like to know about that. The police do the same thing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, and the police both exchanged, we exchanged stories of media things that worked and didn't work. And likewise, when the police want to find out about a crime, they are reliant on the public to come forward and tell them about things that they've seen, as we are reliant upon the public to come forward and tell us. So there is a lot of similarities between the police and UFO investigators and researchers. The other problem facing people doing investigations or research in the UFO phenomena, be they in the Southern Highlands or wherever, is the transfer of experience. Now, again, harping a bit, but at this Mittagong conference we had a physicist who was a very, very good physicist, who was basically, you could put to him the various sightings that you'd seen, etc., and he would be able to explain them away. It doesn't really matter what it was. It could have been a firefly at 20 metres, and it could have been this, and it could have been an ionic discharge underneath these certain circumstances. All very factual. But basically it got to the stage where he could quite conceivably convince the audience that he really wasn't there, and that what they were looking at was an archetypal projection from their subconscious. In other words, explain himself to not even be there. So there is a level of investigation which cannot be scientifically analysed because it becomes reducing down to a point where it is nothing there. In other words, if you try hard enough, you can explain away everything. And the reason that it can be done is because a scientist, most importantly, needs data. And if the scientist doesn't have the full data, he can't make a correct assessment. Now, I spoke to the physicist after the conference, and he said, what was the feedback? And I said, well, there was one person, a couple of people in the audience who wanted him to explain, was he really there, to see how he could handle it. So I said, that was really the only sort of criticism. And I said, and then I thought about the transfer of experience, and I said, imagine that that you had gone to see the North Pole and saw the Aurora Australis, where the sky would light up pinks and purples and mauves and blues, and it would probably be a most awesome experience to see the whole sky like that. And then to come back and say, Doug, I saw the Aurora Borealis, it was a totally amazing experience, and it did this and it did that and all the rest of it. And you'd say, well, yeah, Steve, that sounds great. But I'm not going to have the same level of experience that he had because I've got no idea of interpreting what he has seen. He can talk in words about the whole sky being a whole range of different colours, which for most of us here would be a quite amazing experience to see. And yet words can only transfer so much, especially when you're dealing with something of an extraordinary nature. If we're describing a motor car, we've got a pretty good idea of what a motor car is, and it's very easy for me to transfer that information to you. But if I'm talking about a close encounter of the third kind, then I have no plane of reference. In much the same way as those of us, I'm sure we've all had those sort of dreams where, those very lucid dreams, where you wake up and they're quite incredible, and you try and explain them to your partner and you say, well, it was like that house, but when you went through here there was a big courtyard, but there was this glass swimming pool and it went up to the ceiling and then it turned around the left. Does everyone know what I'm talking about with those sort of dreams that are just impossible to explain? Again, what happens is that our partners really give us lip service, or whoever we're talking to give us lip service in that regard and say, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but they really don't. So this transfer of experience, until we can get to a stage, which we can't at the moment, to actually put a projection, I can say, well, this amazing thing is what I saw last night, and I will show you now because I will beam my eyes onto the screen and you will see exactly what I saw. Then we can have full scientific analysis of these phenomena because the scientists will have all the data. While we have to rely on our words only to be able to explain this phenomenon, which has no point of reference, scientific research can only go so far. Moving on to the local reports that we have had. Also, just touching on that, regarding the psychological aspect of dreams and the UFO phenomenon, certainly I think the more that you look into it, the more there is a comparison between what's happening on a psychological basis with our dreams. Our subconscious and the UFO phenomenon are two areas that I believe has a lot of interaction. They're both anomalies. We both really don't understand what the subconscious is. Speaking to a professor at Sydney University about what level of subconscious we really understand, and we eventually got down to the anomaly or the analogy that what happens in our conscious mind or in our total mind is that what I see before me right now is my conscious area. What's going on behind me is my subconscious area. And now I know there's a lot of activity going on in front of me, but in our minds there is an equal, if not more advanced amount of activity going on behind us that we're just simply not aware of because our train of vision will only take in that amount of area. As we become more advanced, it will expand and we'll find out a bit more about what's going on in the other part of our brain. But at this stage, we're not ready to cope with that. Now, I'll start off with this report because this is certainly, I think, in the Southern Highlands, the most interesting report that I've had, that I've investigated, and this happened about 200 or 300 metres from my home to someone else, which was quite unusual. On the 10th of April 1994, Pat heard her neighbour's clock chime at 9:30 p.m. and excused herself to walk home, only one vacant block away. Halfway back home, two amber discs, she said about the size of dinner plates, appeared about an arm and a half in front of her. The two amber lights then took up a position over her head. She was too frightened to look up, but when she looked down, she saw that there was a white light surrounding her, like a house light, she said. They came down again in front of her. During this experience, she said that she felt nothing and empty during this time this was on. Then they came back up over her again. She went to lift one leg to run, but just couldn't move, whether it was fear or whatever it was, I don't know. And then they took off back over her head. The whole time she didn't look up in this situation. So then she bolted for home. And while this was going on, her husband, remember that she'd left about 9:30. She might have got out the door about 9:33. And her husband, watching Basic Instinct, the Sunday movie at the time, And with the ad breaks going through at about every 15 minutes, he noticed it was about 9:45. And he remember thinking to himself that she's normally home by now. And the ads came back on, so that's about 10:48, or the movie came back on about 10:48. Then it was some time after that Pat came through the door in a very distressed state. So we're looking at probably about 20 minutes at least missing time in this case. Now, after the event, this was on the Sunday night this happened, she reported it to the hotline on the Monday. I rang her on Monday night, and I saw her on the Wednesday. When I went to see her, she had hot water bottles under both her knees because she complained after the incident she couldn't get her knees warm. They were very, very cold. Her face was very hot, although not hot to touch or red in colour, but just felt very hot. So she had some sort of physical effect. Now, after going through, again, we're not psychologists. We've really got to go into a situation and talk to people and make a gut judgment on what we think is the situation. Now, she seemed like a very reasonable, down-to-earth person, living a very ordered existence. There were no other special emotional upset going on in her life, such as, someone close with grave illness or marriage breakup or anything like that. So everything was fairly stable in her life. There was no history of great desire to sort of go on about the UFO research. She had very little interest in that. She didn't read books and all this sort of thing. She was on no particular form of medication at all, no new form of medication. Now, the only other rational explanation I could have for this was some form of catatonic epilepsy. The reason for this was because it was summer and she had long pants on. Well, April actually, still warm, but she had long pants on. Now, the road outside had no street lights in it. It was a new area where Hilltop is, it's not a built-up area. There were no street lights. It was black as pitch. And the road had recently been redone. Now, she's the last house in a cul-de-sac. And because there's not a lot of traffic there, the blue metal that gets dropped there when they redo the road is I don't know if you've ever felt the blue metal that has been on a road that they actually put on it. It's very, very sharp. It gets rolled out and smoothed out after traffic after a period, but when it originally goes down, it's like a razor, and you can't put too much pressure downwards on that before it actually raises blood. So if she had collapsed and had some sort of aneurysm, there definitely would have been scarring and abrasions on her legs, which there wasn't any at all. So she had to be standing up during the whole thing. Now, there is a form of catatonic epilepsy whereby that does happen, but it is known at birth, or it is a congenital disease that happens throughout childhood. This woman was 50 and had no previous effect of it at all. So it's not something that's not like a disease, like a cold, that you're going to catch at 50 or that's suddenly going to occur at 50. That particular form of catatonic epilepsy is rare and also congenital. So when you come up with something, when you're faced with something like this, it does stretch the boundaries of what you can actually understand it by. And it also shows the limitations, as I said, that we have in scientific research in that regard, because although our friend, the physicist Steve, could possibly explain it, or even a psychologist would possibly explain it by saying that it may have been, at the moment I think there's a certain psychological area of belief that is saying that the UFO phenomenon is in fact birth trauma that we experience because of some form of stimuli in certain conditions. And again, this is like ionisation coming from a plane, given that the temperature is 15.23, given that it is a Tuesday, given as Mars that is in alignment with Jupiter, this could possibly happen. And so this is the problem that we're up to when we're dealing from both scientific and in some areas of non-evolved psychology, these sort of areas. So basically, in conclusion, I'd just like to say that you, the public here, are the tool by which we will understand the UFO phenomenon better. Thank you.
All right, if I may, let me introduce someone who is certainly well known here in Australia. Like I said before, there's never enough time to hear all that he has to say. And what he has to say usually upsets a lot of people. He is widely known as the Charles Fort of Australia for his lifelong fascination and research into all aspects of Australian unexplained mysteries and enigmas of our prehistory. He dares to question the blind dogma of scientific conformity and constantly gets in trouble for it. We like that in a person. For those of you who like what you hear today and want more, you'll find plenty in his recent book you can pick up at most bookstores, The Mysterious Australia. And I'd also like to announce at this time that we are going to put on a conference, a seminar like this in the Blue Mountains in October or November. And we'll be featuring Rex Gilroy. He'll have all the time he needs to make the case of the century for you, as well as speakers from around Australia like we have here today, some great video material, in a great atmosphere up in the Blue Mountains with people in that area who will be presenting their cases and their investigations in an area that is known for its mysterious happenings. So without further delay, to give him his 15 minutes today, Rex Gilroy.
Thank you. Well, seeing I won't be able to cover everything, I'll try as many slides as I can in the time I've got, but I'd like to share something with you. For 25 years now, I've been searching for evidence that Homo erectus was in Australia. We have skulls leading from him. Well, a fortnight ago out at Mudgee, I kicked a lump of rock out of the ground that turned out to be a fossil endocast, and for anyone that's interested outside there, I can show you the skull. It's at least 400,000 years old. I haven't had time to advertise it yet, but I believe it is going to upset the archaeological picture in Australia in time. In fact, I believe that Homo erectus, like a number of other scientists, did enter Australia over a land bridge and here evolved into modern man before he did elsewhere, and that some of these modern humans developed in the course of time a megalithic culture, in fact a Stone Age civilization, which I believe was eventually carried out of Australia based on datings all the way up into Asia and across into Europe. For example, in Europe, Stonehenge, Karnak, 5,000 years old, and as you get back through Western Asia, the datings are going back to 8 to 10,000 into Southeast Asia. By the time you get to New Guinea, they're about 12, 14,000 years, and in Australia, they're well over 15,000 years and possibly well over 20 in some areas. I believe this mother civilization could have even been the origin of Atlantis, but that's another story. Slides, thank you. We have here a graph showing the Bathurst skulls that I've had for many years. We have a reconstruction of two endocasts you're about to see, the Solo and Wadjak people. The Wadjaks are a proto-Aboriginal race that entered Australia, interbred with the Solo, or first Homo sapiens, and from this admixture the modern day Aborigines appeared possibly by a couple of 100,000 years ago. Next slide. In fact, the bottom picture would have shown you the outline of a Homo erectus skull, which will give you an idea of what this skull type is I've got in my bag. Here's the endocast of the Wadjak type skull. It's even got strata lines where the mud has filled the skull and fossilised over a period of time. The bone matter has fallen away and left the cast. Sometimes bone and stone form together. Now, next. Then there's the Solo or Homo sapiens skull. And my late father found this in 1972. I found the other one 12 months later within 100 feet of the other at the same occupation site at South Bathurst. Next. Here's a Homo erectus type skull. You can see the receding forehead, thick eyebrow ridges. That's basically what my skull in the bag looks like, although it's minus its right hand side. Next slide. My wife and I are on an expedition recently, but that's not us. This is Homo erectus, what he and she might have looked like. So you can imagine what I claim lived in Australia. Next slide. We can race through these, unfortunately, but you'll get the full the full picture at the Springwood Conference. These are footprints of normal-sized hominids in Canangra Boyd National Park. They're in mudstone that was covered by a volcanic ash flow. A university geologist said the last volcanic eruptions up there in that particular spot ended 3 million years ago. This means the out of Africa picture is wrong and that there were primitive hominids already present in Australia, leaving impressions of already normal type feet. Now, the next, you can see in the next slides this trackway of at least 7 footprints. You can see some of them are anything up to 12 centimetres into the mud and others 5 centimetres. Go straight through these, Andrew, and we'll just get through them. The fact is, man in Australia is very ancient, and at some stage in the last 50,000 years, populations settled down and began studying the stars. They noticed the heavens. Stone Age man was fascinated by them, and so he started to line up stones to align with various stars and planets. This star cult eventually led him to realise that the movements of the heavens corresponded with seasonal change, and this led to agriculture. You know that picture. Here is a map that shows a Glen Innes Stonehenge site that's about 20 acres that I discovered 20 years or so ago. The biggest, next slide will show you this enormous pear circle at the bottom is the biggest one I've found yet in Australia. Some of the stones in it weigh anything up to 50, 60 tonnes. Many of them are so ancient they're just breaking away, and what I do is reconstruct them as they would have looked. Someone with a computer could do the same thing, but I have to do it the hard way. You can see it's at least 500 foot on the old scale by about 300 foot wide. And next one, here's some of this is the pointer stone at the western end. It's on an east-west alignment, and when you stand behind the stone further back, you can actually, the ancients could have lined up the summer solstice at the far end. Keep going. We'll get through as many as we can. The western end has a triangular formation on its own, and I've still yet got to work out what that's for. But some of the stones are weathering away. What you've got to do is imagine what they originally looked like and not weather-worn as they are now. These things have been standing there 20, 30,000 years or more, maybe 50,000, maybe earlier, who knows. But we have evidence of a very primitive culture. Keep flicking. There's heather there next to a very large, well, it was once a single rock. It's just cracking away now. How did they move these stones into place? These are secrets modern science can't even answer. And here is an opening. Can't really see. On such short notice, I missed out on some slides. I had to get them sent down from Tamworth. But there is a gap here of 30 foot through which you could see the summer solstice rising on an opposite hill. Now, nearby there is a smaller stone circle, and there are 3 pointers here. Sorry, these seem to be back to front, but these 3 pointers point out in a northwest direction, and I don't know what they pointed to yet. I've still got to do some more work there. Maybe the constellation has shifted that they pointed to, but anyway. Here's some of the slides. You can see people use them, but there's a farmer up there, uses them to run his horses on and whatever. He competes in the local show. There's an altar stone here, and we have a couple of stones there pointing off in the direction of the northwest. You can't see them all. I'm missing that slide, unfortunately. Keep going. We don't know what these altar stones are for, maybe sacrificing people, who knows. But there is a 30-foot wide gap through which those stones, directly behind my wife, pointed to the northwest. Now, further on, there's this 328.7 metre length alignment going east-west, and it was erected to plot the summer solstice. Now, this enormous 15.3 metre tall stone, the Grand Menhir of Glen Innes, I've called it, it's now on its back, but when it was erected, it would have lined up with the summer solstice sunrise, and if you stood well back here, you could line it up with these stones. Now, next slide, there are 9 grooves, badly weathered now, but I believe that when this was erected, it would have been used to trap the receding shadow of the rising sun on the summer solstice. Some of the stones are just weathering away, cracking away and weathering, you can see. I found some Aboriginal stone flakes of what we call the Capertian culture. Some of them go back about 16,000 years. They could have some indication that the Aborigines had moved in and taken over the area. So these people have been gone a mighty long time. 20 acres. Now there's other sites in that area. There are other sites in New England, in the Moonbee Range area. Keep on going. This will give you a sneak preview of what to expect at a bit more leisurely length when we hold the Springwood Conference. In fact, I've got quite a few surprises. That enormous boulder, for example. How did they do it? We have the remains of an enormous, well, reasonably large, 50-yard or so wide circle, but it's composed of gigantic boulders here that are about 50 tonnes apiece. And next slide. You've got a tree growing slap bang up in the centre of that centre stone. In fact, it's cracked in between a couple and one stone rather than broken into two pieces. They look natural, but what I do is imagine what they look like when they were intact and with a lot of soil missing. So this was one single rock at some stage, but it's disintegrating. And we have a long shot. It's impossible to photograph the circle as such. One would have to have an aircraft, I think. I haven't got that sort of money, never will have. Well, I'll spend it on books. We also have a temple. Well, I've called it a temple at the moment. I don't know enough about it yet, but you can see it's laid out very interestingly. Now, there's a couple of altar stones. Next. Oh, we're getting further than I thought. That's the end wall. It faces the east, and the next slide will show you the eastern face. There's a rather large open area there, and there's an altar stone. We'll see a close-up here somewhere of a very interesting one. That's got a, next one. There's a groove cut up the side of it to show, well, sort of a walkway up to the top of the stone so you can get sacrificed. You can see here, it's back to the front, unfortunately. But very interesting. Next. I've got some very interesting altar stones around Australia. Some of them are shaped in the forms of eagles and serpents. And out in the Bathurst area, over 25 years ago, I found this. An alignment going 3 kilometres. Those stones are 3 foot, 3 foot, 3 foot, and they're broken by maybe a set of 6 foot, 6 foot, 6 foot slides, stones, and then you might have that measurement broken again by an odd measurement, and it keeps on repeating itself mathematically, sometimes ending up to 10, 15 feet apart on the old scale. So there's some mathematical business here. I'm not a mathematician, maybe someone can help me there. Next, we have another one that goes for 3 kilometres. Both these face north-south, and they're 2 kilometres apart. This, for example, covers about 3,000 stones. Now, I've just found another one just after the UFO conference at Lismore in the casino area, and it's about a couple of 100 yards long, but it's made out of very large rocks. This is and I've got slides ready to show them later, but this is a rather large standing stone erected on a 16-foot base of carved granite blocks that are just weathering away. You can see one part of it there. I didn't dare excavate it because nearby farmers would have seen it, and vandalism soon follows these things when they're exposed. Next, there's the base. Keep going, Andrew. This is the gate of the moon. I call it that because these enormous blocks, when it's around the right way, have a small stone here. Next, and that large gap, when you stand well back, on April 20th, 1980, I observed a full moon rising in the afternoon level with that stone. Next, 6 foot away is a second stone, and 103 foot away is a third one. And that was, the moon aligned itself with those three, shaving along that, what is actually the north wall of that gate formation.
2 minutes, Rex.
These people must have worked to a plan, and that means a written script. I have found the script. These are just a couple of shots. but it's very similar to Celtic Ogham, but I believe it's a mother script because there are elements of Sumerian, Phoenician, Celtic type script, pictographic and epigraphic writing, and I've been able to effect some translations after 20 years research. Sorry about that, but if you come along to the October conference.
That's just a preview for what's coming later in the year. A fantastic show planned in the Blue Mountains.